Thank you for joining us at the Roundtable.
Brought to you by Community Education Arts, a nonprofit organization based in Noblesville, Indiana.
I'm Alice Cavanis-Gober, president of CEArts.
And I'm Sarah E. Morin, secretary of CEArts. Let's sit down at the Roundtable. I'd like to remind you a little bit about our NICE project. Our NICE project is always based upon classic literature. There's always going to be unavoidable issues that come with the study of literature, with intolerance, prejudice, discrimination, racism, gender bias, domestic abuse, as well as problematic social inequalities due to the class systems and patriarchal dominance. Our project's goals are to breathe new life into the classics by encouraging critical thinking, in-depth discussions of themes and issues in the works selected, and to invite you to experiment with your creativity. With these goals in mind, we'll do our best to discuss any unpleasant and discomforting aspects of our book choices, with understanding the cultural context of the times in which they were written and the periods in which the stories are set, and a consciousness of how these books relate to today. The books we're studying this year are Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, Dracula by Bram Stoker, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte.
To further our little recap a little bit, we've already discussed racism, prejudice, intolerance, and discrimination in all four of our selected books, and we've looked at structure and its impact in each book.
We haven't mentioned much about Renfield from Dracula yet. Did you want to say anything about him, who is literally, as you put it, the crazy person in the asylum?
Yeah, Renfield is such has become in culture, in the general culture, such a caricature in some ways. Of the crazy person who eats flies and, all the other stuff he eats. He's really gross. He's become such a caricature that, when I reread the book this past year, I was really surprised at how layered his character is. He doesn't start out crazy. He goes crazy. Now, it happens... it happens almost like a prequel. Like, we find out that he went crazy. We don't see him go crazy. By the time we meet Renfield, he's already in the asylum, right? But we learn he used to be not a patient, right? Mm-hmm. And so we learn about his history. And his insanity, we are supposed to believe, or I think we're supposed to believe, is caused by Dracula, right? It's caused by his seduction by Dracula. He wants to serve Dracula, and he takes it upon himself, though, in his own craziness, that it's his job to provide insects and the blood, and it goes from insects, I think, to birds, and then cats, and it's just like it's just gross and crazy. But I do think that one thing that's really interesting about Renfield, in terms of like this isolation issue we're talking about in COVID-19, he definitely gets worse in isolation. He doesn't improve in isolation. So it's kind of like, oops, isolation's not a good thing for people who are slightly mentally unstable,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what do you think about Renfield? Because you're right, we haven't had a chance to talk about him very much.
Right. It occurs to me now that I see some parallels between him and Bertha more than I did prior to today, such as every time we let him out, he causes havoc.
Yes.
Same thing with Bertha. Every time she's out, she's lighting Rochester's bed on fire, or tearing veils, or setting the house on fire.
Yeah.
And also the idea that can we fully blame him for this concept that if I serve this strange Dracula man, I'm going to be free of this prison that I'm in? Can we at least empathize with that?
I think so, because here's the thing, both Bertha and Renfield want to be free from the situations that they're in. Both of them have very limited means of how to achieve that freedom. Bertha, in her madness, let's just go with that terminology, her madness, her methods are violent. Her methods are lashing out. Her methods are trying to escape, you know. Renfield also, I think he manages to escape at least once or twice in the book. I can't remember. But he's constantly trying to figure out how to get to Dracula, to serve him in person, to do things that will make him favored by Dracula, if you will. And he also has equated Dracula with freedom. And so both of them have the same goal, to get out of where they are, to be free. What those definitions of freedom mean to them may be completely different things. I personally think Bertha would just wander around on the moors until she died, as long as she was free. And she'd take down anybody who got in her way while she was out there, you know. Renfield has a more specific goal of finding Dracula and being with him and serving him through eternity or whatever. I don't, you know. So I feel like their isolation has driven them even more mad than they were in the first place, if you could say it that way. And yet they see salvation very similarly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Absolutely. I think my favorite scenes with Renfield are when he presents as a very mild-mannered, polite person, and the scene where he meets Mina.
Yeah.
They like bond like they're best buddies. And I'm like, I wasn't expecting that.
I know.
I'm like, is that something genuine from Renfield's own character? Or is that the influence of Dracula kind of being a seductor?
Yeah.
Seducer.
I think you hit something really crucial that we didn't get a chance to talk about in depth at all before now. And I think that's such a fascinating scene, because it does kind of make you wonder, is Dracula working through Renfield to trick and manipulate Mina into, you know, kind of befriending, or at least being kind to Renfield, bonding with him, as you said, and yet, you know, the danger is lurking within that character. The danger is lurking, the madness, the danger of Dracula is lurking within Renfield. So you have that layer of that encounter, and then you also have Bram Stoker very, very smartly giving us Mina's kindness and innocence in action. She knows who Renfield is at that point. She knows he's in the asylum, right? But she doesn't judge him by that. She meets him open. She's open and innocent in how she relates to him. And that was a very clever thing that Bram Stoker did, because it helps us come to terms with, how did this intelligent, kind, generous woman get sort of sucked in by the Dracula person? Well, she was open to being kind. You know, it works in the storytelling. It's another layer in her personality, Dracula's personality, and Renfield's, all rolled up into one scene. It's great. You know?
Right. And it does something that we never fully see with Jane Eyre and Bertha. It humanizes Renfield for a brief amount of time.
Yeah, it does. And you're right, we don't see that with Bertha, again, unfortunately, because most of Bertha comes through someone else's perspective. So that's a really good scene in Dracula. I think the madness in isolation in Dracula is really key when Jonathan's at Dracula's castle, and it's a slow, seductive progression into kind of a sense of isolation and madness. I mean, Jonathan doesn't go there and immediately think, oh my gosh, I'm isolated and it's preying upon my mind. I mean, this takes time. When he's writing to Mina, and in his journal and everything, we see it play out over time. And it makes us think about madness, in different ways, because, how do we see madness in the time period that the book was written in, that it takes place as opposed to now. You know, there's a lot of questions that can be brought up just by reading Dracula, let alone the other three books. I think that the fact that Jonathan ends up escaping, number one, and number two, having a mental and physical breakdown after his escape, are kind of key messages, if you will, in that whole madness and isolation thing. It can break you to the point where you literally are in a hospital bed, right? I mean, that's kind of like, whoa, the isolation can do some serious damage. Temporary in Jonathan's case, he can recover, especially with the love of a good woman by his side. So, you know, we have some interesting little fun things to do with the serious heavy stuff as well. Mm-hmm. What do you think about Lucy and Mina in terms of, you know, what could be called their madness, their strange behavior once Dracula gets his fangs in them, gets his hooks in them? You know, in some ways, you know, we have at different points in the story, each of them, Lucy and Mina, are sort of quarantined at some point. Mina as being protected from Dracula, Lucy too, although less effectively. I think Dracula gets to Lucy a lot easier than he gets to Mina. Mm-hmm. When Lucy is supposed to be in quarantine and isolated and nobody can get to her. Of course, they don't realize yet that Dracula can change his shape and fly into the window or something, you know. But
it's just so COVID. It's like, here come the germs that are in the air, and it's like the garlic around her neck is her mask that someone took off. I mean, it's all COVID.
That it's his mouth, his bite that's infecting them, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. Where it's like for us in COVID-19, it's what we are exhaling out of our mouths that mm-hmm. infects people. I mean, it's just, oh my gosh. You know, we definitely have some parallels there, you know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think that Dracula and Jane Eyre both are really good in terms of isolation, mental illness, and relating all that to COVID-19 issues of isolation. I think Gone with the Wind is maybe not quite so easy to make those kind of COVID-19 comparisons, but I will say that, you know, the issues in Gone with the Wind, like the war, the horrors of war, if you will, play a big part in mental illness and isolation. We have Gerald O'Hara, who is Scarlett's father. He loses his mind, you know, after the war. And, you know, he kind of loses his mind after his wife dies. And I don't think the war is quite over yet when that happens. But by the time the war is truly over, he has totally lost his mind. And, you know, in a modern reading of the story, you could say that maybe he had some early dementia or, you know, something like that. But we are told in the book that it's because he couldn't deal with the trauma of losing his wife and the destruction of his way of life after the war, that's why he loses his mind. His loss of sanity, if you will, if I can say it that way, is crucial to Scarlett's attitude and her personhood forevermore. She has to be the man of the family, right? And I mean that in the cultural context of the story. All the things that made her seem outside the norm before, her strength, her individualism, before the war, those were, you know, those could almost be described as, oh, she's insane to act that way. Other, you know, her peers would look at her that way. But after the war, those are the qualities that she has to really hold on to and develop in order to survive and take mm-hmm. care of her family, including her feeble-minded father, which is how he's described at times, feeble-minded, you know. So the wartime sense of isolation, there's a comfort in taking action against the common enemy. When Scarlett and Melanie fight off the Yankee soldier and they fight through the poverty and the madness of the war and all that kind of stuff, you know, that really propels the story along. So the negatives of isolation and madness help propel our story's more positive features, I think. Does that make sense?
It does, no.
Join us next time as we continue our recap discussion for the 6th annual NICE project. This has been At the Round Table with Alice
And Sarah E.
of Community Education Arts.
Our nonprofit organization is based in Noblesville, Indiana. You can find us online at CEArts.org. We'd like to thank James Weston for writing our intro music and for his technical savvy.
Join us next time
At the Round Table.